What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another Warhammer 40,000 rules breakdown. Today, we're going to be talking about aircraft. Now, aircraft are a bizarre unit in 40k. They have a ton of unique mechanics, and while they're not seen super often, they do show up occasionally. We see them in armies like Ironstorm Spearhead running Stormraven gunships. So I think it's important to understand the aircraft mechanics and exactly how this keyword and its special abilities function. Aircraft units have the specific aircraft keyword. These tend to be large, high-altitude flying units, jet fighters and gunships, and in some cases, dragons and also, like bee monsters. Now, aircraft have an entirely unique set of mechanics governing how they move, fight, draw line of sight, and in some cases even measure distances. However, before we jump into that, I want to cover a really important ability that some aircraft units, not all, but very specific ones, have access to: hover mode. This is a special ability, so it is included in the ability section of a datasheet, and it is a core rules ability. If you have the hover mode ability, you can, during the battle formation step of the game, that's before the game begins, at the time where you would declare reserves, transports, and attached leader associations when they join units, you can declare to activate hover mode on the aircraft unit. If you do so, that unit is no longer considered aircraft. It loses the keyword entirely, which means, importantly, all of the rules that we are about to talk about do not apply to hover mode units. I'll point out some very specific instances where this comes up in a big way, but essentially they just are treated as a normal flying vehicle. They have their movement adjusted from 20 plus inches, which is the standard movement for an aircraft unit, to just 20 inches, and they measure that movement like a normal vehicle. They typically have fly. It would be weird if aircraft didn't fly. So they are able to use through-the-air movement when moving over ruins and terrain features, and because of that high movement characteristic, moving around terrain is not too hard for them. Now, they're also able to be set up like a normal unit, which is important because aircraft have unique deployment rules, which we will talk about right now. So an aircraft unit that is not in hover mode must begin the game in reserve. I have an entire video about exactly how reserves work, but essentially there are two categories of reserves. There are strategic reserves and there are regular reserves. Strategic reserves are part of your regular reserve pool, but not all units are part of that reserve pool. Typically, you can include up to half of the points and unit count in your army in reserves, and aircraft will count against this restriction. However, once the game begins, so that is after the battle formation step, during your resolution of start of battle abilities, the aircraft transition from the normal reserves to strategic reserves. This seems like a meaningless distinction, but what it means is that when you put your aircraft into reserve at the beginning of the game, while they count against the requirement that only half of your army starts in reserve, they don't count against the restriction that only a quarter of your army can start in strategic reserve, since that's checked in the battle formation step. In addition, they also then use strategic reserve rules for setting up on the table. This means that they're going to come off of a table edge and have all the normal restrictions that strategic reserves have. They cannot arrive in battle round 1 at all unless they have some sort of special ability, because that is a distinct requirement inside the core rules. They also cannot deploy outside 6 inches of a table edge, although it is important to note that aircraft use their base for measurement. So if you have wings or other extended parts of the model, that is able to extend past that area and also able to extend off of the battlefield because it's not actually used for measurement. It also means that you can't deploy in the enemy deployment zone in Battle Round 2, although that restriction is lifted in Battle Round 3. In past editions, aircraft had special mechanics for setting up on the table where they would deep strike in. Unless you have a special ability on the aircraft unit, that is no longer the case. They still must arrive from a table edge. This also means that aircraft that have abilities that trigger when they move over enemies will not be able to trigger them on the turn that they arrive. While they're considered to have completed a movement, they didn't actually move, so you don't get to measure abilities like bombing runs, for example. Importantly, this is one of the big benefits of entering hover mode with your aircraft, since a hover mode vehicle doesn't have these restrictions. It's not required to begin the game in reserves and doesn't transition to strategic reserves, so while you could reserve it if you wanted to, you can also just deploy it normally on the battlefield, giving you use of that aircraft from the first battle round onwards, rather than having to wait until battle round 2 for aircraft to arrive. Now, measuring with aircraft is fairly unique as well. Aircraft units are one of the protected unit types that specifically uses its base for measurement unless otherwise specified. This means that you're always going to ignore the hull of the model when measuring to and from that model. However, Technically, if you were to activate your hover jets with an aircraft and use the hover mode to remove the aircraft keyword, it would then not be protected by that restriction, meaning that you are able to measure to and from the hull of the aircraft instead. This is, to be honest, kind of a logistical nightmare, since many aircraft models are on variable height flying stands, and measuring vertical distances or horizontal distances to and from the hull is really weird. So I know that there are a lot of competitive formats that actually allow you to ignore this rule, simply because it makes the game much simpler, but technically, you must still measure to and from the aircraft hull when you're in a hover mode. You just act as essentially a normal vehicle. That will still use the base as well, so if there's a portion of the base that's closer than the vertical portion of the model, you'll measure to and from that, because the base is indeed part of the model for measuring, but you will also be able to use its extended bits to measure to and from. Keep in mind, though, that the verticality of the measurement still counts. You're not simply measuring along the horizontal plane, no pun intended. So you'd have to measure at a diagonal from the part of the nose of the aircraft or the wing of the aircraft to your base, which is why things get super funky. Now, I mentioned that aircraft have kind of weird rules when it comes to line of sight, and they have some protrusions and things that they can use for true line of sight. And that is important to remember when we're talking about aircraft and line of sight, because they do have unique mechanics. While not in hover mode, obviously, once you're in hover mode, you use normal line of sight rules because you're no longer an aircraft. Another crucial difference between hover mode vehicles and aircraft proper. Aircraft always use true line of sight for measuring their line of sight. Normally in Warhammer 40k, there are terrain features like ruins, for example, that will block line of sight to units not within the ruin from units not entirely within the ruin, meaning that if I had a unit standing here, it would not be able to see the Hive Tyrant because there would be ruins in the way. However, aircraft ignore that restriction. Aircraft are always able to measure true line of sight, regardless of whether or not there is a ruin intervening that would normally block their line of sight mechanically. On top of that, some terrain features such as woods also provide cover to units behind them, even if line of sight is not blocked between them. However, aircraft always ignore that restriction as well. They simply draw a true line of sight, and if the true line of sight is blocked physically by the terrain feature, by the trees on the wood base or the woods base itself, then the line of sight would be blocked. However, other units tracing their attacks over the woods would automatically benefit from cover. Aircraft do not have that restriction. This means that in this case, while this Hive Tyrant would be safe from basically any other attacker in this instance, despite the fact that there are two ruins intervening between the Storm Raven gunship over here and the Hive Tyrant, the Storm Raven can still see it just fine. Now, importantly as well, ruins will also provide cover to units who are hiding any part of their model behind that ruin terrain feature. This means that it is more difficult for aircraft to both be penalized by and benefit from cover as imposed by ruins. While normally a model who's, for example, half protected by a ruin would benefit from cover from that ruin, because an aircraft model is ignoring that ruin for the purposes of its line of sight, they are simply measuring true line of sight, they would be able to see the entirety of the model because they're ignoring the portion of the model that would be normally hiding behind the ruin terrain. This is essentially true in the reverse as well. A unit is able to draw line of sight to an aircraft, even if it is hiding behind a ruined terrain feature, as long as they have true line of sight to it. And aircraft are also not going to gain cover from ruined terrain if they are hiding behind the template, only if they have their true line of sight blocked by the physicality of the terrain feature. So in this case, while a normal unit would have its extended portion over here behind the ruin and would benefit from cover, in this case the aircraft would not. However, it is important to note that all parts of a model are considered when you are checking your line of sight. Aircraft are typically mounted on a large base and have a large flying stand, meaning in instances like this, where it is potentially possible for the Hive Tyrant to have line of sight to the entirety of the gunship itself on the Storm Raven miniature, because the Storm Raven's base is down here behind the vertical elements of that terrain feature, they are typically going to benefit from cover in reverse. So while aircraft are easier to see than normal units, they also will often gain the defensive benefits of those ruins, even if their targets are not. I should note as well that true line of sight still requires that you can trace an unbroken line from your model to the target model. This means that if you have particularly tall or voluminous ruins, they will still block line of sight for the gunship. Obviously, we can't see the Hive Tyrant who's hiding behind that wall right there because the wall is huge. You simply ignore the rule that says that ruins always block line of sight to stuff outside them, but you still have to have normal line of sight. You follow all the normal line of sight rules where you have to be able to trace a line from your model to the target model. This is commonly misinterpreted. Aircraft don't get a free reign over every ruin. They're simply able to see over the smaller ruins that don't have large solid walls that would normally obstruct their attacks. This does make aircraft particularly useful for seeing enemies that are trying to hide. If, for example, your game plan is predicated on hiding artillery units, indirect fire, or small utility units in these protected areas of terrain that would make you difficult to hit with most conventional units, aircraft are able to circumvent that by drawing true line of sight, meaning that it's much more difficult to hide from an aircraft-equipped army than it is any normal army. And because most of the time they're coming out of strategic reserve and arriving off of the board edges, they will oftentimes have the ability to get the true line of sight that they need to target whatever they want, unless you are very heavily screening them out and they can't come 9 inches away from any enemies, or you have some exceptional line of sight blocking terrain. Now, we've talked about how aircraft set up and how their line of sight operates, but they do also move in unique ways. Aircraft have a kind of bizarre movement characteristic. They have a minimum movement of 20 inches, but an infinite movement at the top end. They're able to move any distance to get where they want to. And while this is still technically movement as you would move any other flying unit, aircraft still use through the air movement to get around terrain. Because their movement is infinite, that vertical distance doesn't really matter. Even if you're paying an extra 12 inches to go up and down over a ruin, it doesn't matter because infinity minus 12 is still infinity. The restriction, however, is that aircraft must always move directly forward. They're not able to stop their movement and redirect it like any other unit in the game can. They must always be moving forward in the direction that their model is facing. This is another benefit that vehicles in hover mode have over aircraft. While they don't get that infinite movement and so still must pay through the air movement in order to move up and down terrain features, for example, they are able to move in any direction. So they're able to move around terrain features and angle themselves in ways that aircraft normally can't. This means that planning where your aircraft are going to be going is very important when you're moving or setting them up, because that's the direction that they're going to have to move on the subsequent turn. And while the distance that you travel can be functionally infinite, if you're moving in an incorrect direction and it's moving you out of line of sight or range of enemy units, that can be unfortunate for you. Now, that minimum movement is also a commonly misinterpreted mechanic. While aircraft can move up and down terrain and pay movement to do so out of their total movement of infinity, that doesn't actually count against their minimum move. An aircraft's minimum movement is the minimum distance horizontally that it must end from its starting position. This means that an aircraft moving over 20 inches of terrain is still not able to count that against its minimum movement. If all parts of the model's base did not end that move more than 20 inches away from its starting position, that's not a legal movement. However, you can reorient aircraft upon moving them. After they complete that movement of at least 20 inches from their starting position in a straight line, they're then able to pivot up to 90 degrees. This is particularly easy in Tabletop Simulator, a little bit tougher in real life, but not too bad, because we can actually just set our rotational distance to 90. And give us a nice 1/4 turn. This means that aircraft can reorient up to 1 quadrant, essentially, in either direction at the end of their movement to set up for their movement on the subsequent turn. Again, planning out your moves with aircraft is crucial to being able to use them effectively. Now, aircraft still have the normal restrictions that other units do. They are flying units, so they can move over enemies as long as they clear their engagement range and are not allowed to end their movements engaging other enemies. This can make it possible to prevent aircraft from actually completing their moves legally by stringing out enemies in front of them, where their landing zone, essentially, after their minimum movement would end them up. And because aircraft tend to have large bases, that's fairly reasonable. Now, if that is ever the case, or an aircraft's movement crosses its base, importantly, not the rest of their model, because aircraft specifically use their hull for measurement, the rest of their model can protrude over the edges of the battlefield. If that base crosses the edge of the battlefield or their minimum movement can't be completed, completed, they simply enter strategic reserve and then can arrive in the future reinforcement step with a normal strategic reserve restriction. It's important to note as well that aircraft must do so on the subsequent turn, so unlike many strategic reserves, they can enter strategic reserves and then hold off until the best turn to arrive back in. They must immediately come back in your next reinforcement step. Now, we'll talk about charging aircraft and engaging them momentarily, but it is possible to engage aircraft in melee. If an aircraft begins its movement engaged, it is still able to move normally. While they aren't technically allowed to remain stationary or advance, they just move normally even if enemies are engaging. And because that's not a fallback move, they're never required to take desperate escape checks, even if they're battle shocked. That also allows them to shoot and operate normally otherwise later on in the turn, so they're not really worried about being engaged whatsoever. Now, I mentioned that enemy units have some weird restrictions when moving around aircraft. Aircraft do not block your opponent's movement like other enemy units would. Normally in 40k you have to move around enemy units. While you can usually move through your own models, you can't move through enemy models. Flying models can move over enemy models as long as they clear their engagement range, and that's essentially the rule you use when moving around enemy aircraft, even if you are not flying yourself. So, while the aircraft's base might be impeding your movement, you are allowed to cross over it while moving as long as you don't end that movement within an inch of it. That doesn't require you to have fly or anything, you can just move through them, so they don't truly block movement. However, because of that engagement range, they will block the potential landing zones that enemy models have around the aircraft model. Now, the restriction that they have to end movements outside of an inch of aircraft models is actually in place for any kind of movement for enemy units. Normally, you can't end normal move advances or fall backs within an inch of enemies, but other types of movements like charges, pile-ins, or consolidates are able to. Aircraft are different, however. Normal enemy units, specifically those that do not have the fly keyword, are never allowed to end a move within an inch of aircraft. This means that even if you have an aircraft right next to you and you're piling in or consolidating, you cannot move into engagement range of that aircraft. That makes it very difficult to be engaged or engage aircraft. Generally speaking, for most non-flying units, it is literally impossible. However, if you do find yourself in engagement range of an aircraft, even if you are a flying unit yourself, you can operate normally, unless you're being engaged by another enemy. So aircraft are basically unimpeded by enemies engaging them because they're still able to make normal moves, and they don't impede enemies from making normal moves themselves. So if you begin a movement engaged by an aircraft, you're able to advance, fall back, remain stationary, whatever you want to do as normal. Now, while this is an incredibly rare situation, the situations in which this could arise are when considering charging and fighting around aircraft. Now, first off, aircraft can never charge. They are entirely ineligible. This means that while some aircraft are actually melee focused, those will typically use the hover mode mechanics and choose to hover at the beginning of the game in that battle formation step. Now, that said, it's not impossible for aircraft to attack in melee. They cannot be charged by normal enemy units. So if you have enemy units on the ground, aircraft cannot be piled in or consolidated into or declared as a charge target. So you also can't move into their engagement range when charging them, although obviously you are allowed to move through them as long as you clear their engagement range, like we talked about before. But enemy units with fly can charge and fight enemy aircraft. Aircraft can likewise only fight flying enemy units. While they can't charge them, if they are charged, they will still attack. However, their attacks can only target units with the fly keyword. Essentially, you gotta fly up to the aircraft to actually hit it. You might have a chance of being hit by the aircraft as you're doing that, but stuff on the ground isn't really gonna be affected by that fight whatsoever. They also, when fighting, just make their attacks. They skip the pile-in and consolidation step of their fight activation. They aren't able to reposition or move to base the enemy models when doing that. They just roll their attacks and then are done. Now, otherwise, units with fly will always follow all the normal rules when dealing with aircraft. The same is not the case for units on the ground, and things get a little hairy in this situation. Like I mentioned before, no move whatsoever can move into engagement range of an aircraft if you are not flying yourself. This includes pile-in and consolidate moves. In addition, non-flying units entirely ignore aircraft for the purposes of determining which enemy unit is the closest to to them for those pile in or consolidate moves. This means that aircraft are basically entirely invisible to enemy units while they are piling in or consolidating. And while they will restrict where those movements can end up, they themselves are never the target or the recipient of engagement from those pile in or consolidate moves. So let's take a look at this example. The termagants here are required now to make either a pile in or consolidate moves. Pile in and consolidate moves, for the most part, operate the same unless you can move to an objective marker. So for the purposes of this demonstration, the distinction of which one you were doing doesn't really matter. Now, the requirements of a pile in or a consolidate move is that each model in the unit moves towards the enemy model that is closest to them, and the unit must end engaging an enemy. In this case, all of the models in this unit are closer to the Stormraven gunship over here than they are this tactical squad. This means that were we to follow the normal rules, the unit would glom onto the Stormraven gunship. They are able to end a pile-in or consolidate move engaging it, and they move closer to it. But because the Stormraven is not in hover mode and has the aircraft keyword, it is both not able to be moved into engagement range of, so the point at which the consolidation move checks to see whether or not you can end its movement engaging that aircraft ignores it, because that's not a legal movement. And the aircraft is not considered to be the closest unit, which means you entirely ignore it. We're basically going to flip it over and pretend it's not here, and these guys would then immediately redirect towards the tactical squad. Not only is the tactical squad now counted as the closest enemy unit, but any moves engaging the Stormraven would be illegal, so in order to successfully complete a pile-in or consolidate move, the termagants would have to move to engage this tactical marine squad. Now, this can also have some other bizarre implications if you are in an ongoing combat that is around an aircraft model. So let's say, for example, that we have our termagants here fighting these tactical marines, and the Hive Tyrant has been selected to activate in the fight phase. Maybe the thing that it charged was already killed, or it's just consolidating. Like we said before, the Stormraven is essentially ignored when performing these pile-in or consolidate moves with non-flying units. However, its engagement range still is not allowed to be moved into, meaning that while the Hive Tyrant would be required to move towards this tactical marine, because that's considered to be the closest enemy unit, there is no legal position where it could end that movement engaging the tactical marine, since it can't move within an inch, and doing so in this instance would bring it into engagement range of the Stormraven, which is not a legal move because it's not allowed to enter the engagement range of aircraft at any point. While the chances that a situation like this arise naturally in a game of 40k are incredibly rare, there is the potential for aircraft to prevent enemy models from piling in or consolidating by restricting the areas of the battlefield that they can successfully move into with the engagement range of the aircraft. Now, it's also important to note that were any of these models to be flying, they would treat the gunship as normal. So, for example, if the Hive Tyrant was a winged Hive Tyrant instead of a foot Hive Tyrant, it would simply consolidate it and attack whoever it wanted to within this area. Now, again, I know these mechanics are fairly complicated, but fortunately for all of us, the times that they will arise in a normal game of 40k are very rare. But it is important to know for the times in which you will be playing with or against an aircraft model. And with that, that's going to be it for this video. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and thanks to everyone who supports the channel and allows me to do these longer form rules deep dives. Whether that's a YouTube channel membership, a Patreon subscriber over on patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, or a Twitch subscriber over on my Twitch channel, I really appreciate all of you. Thanks for watching again. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.